Chapter 15. A single Jeep Cherokee tore through the rough, rocky terrain of the Mojave Desert, kicking up a long trail of dust and rock fragments in its wake that hung in the air, like smaller versions of the multimillion-ton clouds several miles above that spread across the world and blocked out the majority of light and heat from the sun. Cameron held her foot down on the gas pedal, working as much speed out of the old car as she could, trying to put as much distance between them and the hangar as possible. She was pushing 65 miles per hour on the rocky terrain and giving the 3 human occupants of the car a very bumpy ride, but none of them complained. Cameron knew they would have to abandon the car shortly. It was low on gas, and one of the axles was cracked and grinding underneath them. She'd estimated the Cherokee would have broken down 10 minutes ago, but it hadn't, so she was determined to carry on until either the car failed, became too dangerous to drive, or she determined they were safe. She'd aimed to drive them through the remote region west of Victorville, but she knew the car wouldn't last that long anymore. "There's nothing following us." Ellison looked back through the rear windscreen and seeing nothing but dust and empty desert. "He's right, we can slow down now." John leaned forward. "We're okay." Cameron still had access to all of the UCAVs in the air. They were still operational and flew high out of the HK's range. Their radar range included their current location, and there were no HKs within 5 miles of them. She opened her window and poked her head out, scanning the skies with her enhanced vision, glad to be able to see in full color again to make sure there were none following at a distance, flying too low to be detected on UCAV's radars. She saw nothing and was satisfied there were no immediate threats, but still didn't slow down. The factory John Henry had taken control of was still operational, and the first tranche of 24 machines was complete, but she knew Skynet wouldn't tolerate it and would soon attack it with a massed airstrike as it had done with the hangar. The UCAVs would soon run out of fuel, and with no friendly airfields they would crash. But the autonomous infantry units had power cells similar to her own and could operate for long periods of time. She knew they could be useful later, so she sent an order for all 24 operational machines to arm themselves with the plasma rifles supplied in the factory and to head north. Out of LA County and away from both the bulk of Skynet's machines in the area and potentially hostile human fighters. She then issued new target coordinates to the UCAVs in the air. Their last actions would be to release their ground attack munitions on a number of Skynet installations before they ran out of fuel. Cameron spun the wheel left and sharply turned the car hard right, tilting it 40 degrees for several seconds and pinning Savannah and Ellison to their doors before the car leveled out back onto all 4 tires and carried on. "What was that?" Ellison asked, still in shock. He'd held on for dear life, convinced the car would tip over. He looked at Savannah in the seat in front of him and saw her reflection through the rear-view mirror. She looked completely calm and unaffected by it. "We can't be too careful," Cameron said. John knew she was right. "Putting angles between us and them," he added, "same as a hair does." If there was one thing he knew how to do while it was running and hiding. He'd done it more than enough times to know that just putting distance between you and your pursuer wasn't enough, especially when what was hunting you was that much faster. You had to change direction, put angles as well as distance between you to throw them off balance or off your trail, and make it that much harder for them to find you. "Where do we go now?" Savannah asked. "What exactly is our game plan?" John realized they hadn't discussed that since they left. "We want to go back, so what do we need?" he asked. "A time machine," Ellison supplied helpfully. "But I'm guessing now that Skynet's winning the war that it's the only one that'll have one. No resistance means no time machine, right?" "Wrong," Cameron said, keeping her eyes on the road and still searching for any threats from the front. "Skynet's winning, it doesn't need the TDE. It likes things how they are." "TDE?" Savannah asked. "Time displacement equipment," Cameron explained. "Skynet wouldn't have built it." "How are we going to get back without one then?" Savannah huffed. It looked like they wouldn't be going back after all, she guessed. A silver metallic shape rose up from the trunk in a long arc and flowed down into the center seat between John and Ellison. growing taller and wider until it took the new brunette form of Catherine Weaver. She inadvertently touched John's hand as she took form, and a shiver ran up his spine. She was that cold to the touch. How the hell did she ever trick anyone who might brush past her? He wondered. The TDE in Zyracorp's basement, she said. You think that thing will still work? Ellison asked. I built it to last. It's how I planned to return once John Henry was ready. John stared at her for a moment. Of course she'd have had a way back. Machines were nothing if not meticulous. She'd have planned every last-minute detail. I built it into the walls and the floor so it wouldn't be discovered. She turned to face John. Slight problem, Ellison countered. Last time that thing was used, it caused a blackout that lasted 2 days. Half of Southern California was affected. Where are we going to get that kind of power? Cameron knew the answer to that. Serrano Point. An aerial recon conducted days ago had revealed the plant was still operational. Correct, Weaver nodded her head. Without John, there was no resistance. Nobody captured the Serrano Point, and it's still under Skynet's control. She'd planned for it to be run by John Henry, but skipping the last 18 years had meant that Skynet had retaken control in this timeline too. It was no matter. When they returned, it would be entrusted to Cameron, along with much more. They carried on driving through the desert. Cameron had a plan regarding how they could collect the necessary power for the TDE, but there were more immediate matters, and she decided she'd share her idea with John later. The outskirts of Victorville appeared up ahead, and in the distance, the jagged, skeletal remains of 1,000 buildings reached out into the air. HKs were visible to Cameron several miles out. None were nearby and none would see them, but it was still daylight for another 2 hours, and they were an obvious target in the Jeep. We have to get out soon, Cameron told them. Machines will spot the Jeep, and we're almost out of gas. The needle had long since hit empty, and the engine was already spluttering as it struggled to run on the last few fumes. They had perhaps 5 minutes left before they would have to abandon the vehicle and continue on foot. Savannah looked back and saw that, like her, Ellison and John were wearing their seatbelts. Good, she thought. Cameron, stop the car. Cameron slammed on the brakes as hard as she could without putting the pedal through the floor, and the Jeep screeched horrendously with the rapid deceleration. Weaver, not wearing a seatbelt, was launched straight forward past Savannah and Cameron and smashed through the windscreen like a bullet, causing an explosion of liquid metal and shattered glass as she soared over the hood. She splattered against the hard desert ground in front of the car, flattening against the rocky floor and sending pieces of her flying out in globules of flesh-colored semi-liquid metal. What is it? Cameron asked her, searching for whatever threat Savannah had seen. Nothing, she shrugged. Why did you tell me to stop? Cameron pressed, confused. Savannah tilted her head at Weaver on the ground in front of them as the T-1001 started to reform itself. It wasn't wearing a seatbelt, she smirked. You did it. To piss her off, John asked, incredulous. Cameron smiled slightly in amusement. She didn't like Weaver either. Why not? Savannah said nonchalantly as she opened her door and pulled her pack out from underneath her seat. She pulled it on and shouldered her rifle, making sure the M32 was still strapped to her. John, Cameron, and Ellison got out of their respective doors and did the same. Weaver finished shaping herself back into human form. Don't do that again, she snapped irritably at Savannah. Savannah stepped up close to Weaver, a look of pure hatred on her face as she glared at the thing in front of her. She wanted so badly to kill the thing, and it pissed her off to no end that she couldn't. Listen to me, you liquid metal freak, she snarled, her voice full of hostility. Just stay the fuck away from me. She sucked up a mouthful of saliva and spat hard into Weaver's face. Weaver made no response. Savannah's hostility towards her didn't matter unless she became a problem to their plans. If the girl did, then she'd have to deal with her. Savannah turned away from her, shouldered her rifle, and took point, marching across the rocky ground towards Victorville. John groaned inwardly. He didn't know what to do if Savannah and Weaver couldn't manage to work together. They all needed each other. He'd have to get Ellison to talk some sense into her later. He reckoned she might listen to him. Weaver, take the rear. Ellison, you're behind me and Cameron. We need to find somewhere to hide up so we can decide how we're going to get the TDE back up and running. Let's go." With Savannah setting the pace, they started the march to Victorville. John left Cameron behind Savannah and went back to Ellison. "Give me your rifle," John told him. Ellison nodded and pulled the HK-417 and its sling off his shoulder, removing some of the burden he was carrying. "And the magazines?" John asked. Ellison opened up a pouch and pulled out 4 magazines clipped together in pairs, totaling 6 with the pair already connected to the rifle. "Spare rounds are in the right pocket," he gestured to his rucksack. "Thanks," John said. "We'll get them later." He jogged forward to Cameron and held out the rifle and magazines. "I got you a present." "It's tight," Cameron replied with a slight smile on her face, remembering how she said the same thing once before. John grinned too as he recalled her saying it a few times so long ago. Happier times, he thought. Well, relatively anyway. They continued on into the outskirts of Victorville, as the desert gave way to the remains of streets and houses, many of which had been blown apart, but not by nuclear blast waves, John noted. They passed the rusting remains of an Abrams tank in the middle of one road. There was a massive gaping hole where the turret joined the main body of the tank, large enough that any of them could have crawled inside through it. As they got closer to it, John could see a charred skeleton still sat in one of the chairs inside. "Probably got roasted alive when the tank took a hit," Savannah said. "Not a nice way to go." "Looks like there was a hell of a fight here," Ellison commented. All around them were skeletal remains of soldiers, some still wearing their Kevlar helmets and boots their destroyed vehicles, and the wrecks of the few machines they'd managed to bag before losing the battle. Practically every house had been damaged to varying degrees. Some had been completely obliterated by bombs, artillery, or tank shells, whilst others had merely minor structural damage to them. The sight reminded Cameron of many similar scenes in the future she'd originated from, and also the one she and John Henry had passed shortly before they'd met up with Weaver. The area was littered with burnt, twisted and rusty military vehicles and bones full and partial skeletons. Every street ahead was blocked by walls of cars and trucks' improvised barricades to delay the machine's advance, she knew. Some of them had been penetrated. One 12-foot-high barricade had been blown apart in the middle, and a pair of T-1 drones, the predecessors of the Centaur tanks, stood inactive. Their top sections had been blown apart. They were defending the city, Cameron said, as they marched through the remains of the barricade. Inside was similar carnage, but multiplied tenfold. They tried to hold the machines, but failed. Cameron found herself sympathetic to the long-dead human soldiers. She identified with them. They died defending the civilian population from the machines, as she would for John without hesitation. She was surprised at her empathy for the dead soldiers and was unsure of where the sensation had originated. "I don't like being out in the open like this," Ellison said nervously. It was too dangerous to be traveling out in the open during daylight. They hadn't run into a single machine yet, but he couldn't believe there'd be none here. "He's right," John said. He looked around for a likely place, but it was all the same. Destroyed houses and office buildings, jagged piles of rubble and metal that could cut a man to pieces if he tried to hide inside. Evidence of the sheer ferocity of the battle that had once raged through Victorville. Cameron searched for somewhere they could hide and quickly located a manhole cover. She went up to it and pulled it up, looked inside and deemed the sewer tunnel underneath was large enough for them all to fit inside. "Here," she called the others to her. They could use the sewers to travel to the other side of the city without being spotted by HKs. One by one, they all climbed down into the sewer, and Cameron closed the cover after them, immersing them in total darkness. "I can't see a thing," Ellison said quietly. Savannah took off her pack and pulled out her night vision goggles. For a long time, she and Ellison had only had the one pair between them, and he'd always insisted she keep them. She put them on, and the world reappeared in a ghostly green glow. Cameron and Weaver had no problem seeing at all, however. Cameron grasped John's hand in hers and laces her fingers with his, noticing that John didn't try to pull away. "I'll guide you," she told him. "Thanks," John smiled at her gratefully. He noted that he once again depended on Cameron, even more now she was seeing for him. He didn't like having to depend on someone else to act as his eyes. It reminded him of when Derek and Kyle had frog-marked him blindfolded down the tunnel, and he'd fallen over and stepped on all manner of unpleasant things. He knew Cameron wouldn't let that happen to him, though. He knew he could depend on her. "How far is it to LA?" Ellison asked. Cameron reviewed her knowledge of Southern California and calculated the distance in a fraction of a second. 62.8 miles to Zyracorp, she said. "As the crow flies," John pointed out. "Going through the sewers here and in LA might take it up to 100. "Hell of a trek," Savannah commented. "It could take them a day or more just to make their way through the sewers in the darkness. With only 3 out of 5 of them able to see anything moving quickly would be impossible." John nodded in silent agreement with her, but it had to be done. "We'll keep going through the sewer until we hit the outskirts on the other side. Once we're clear of the city, we should be safe enough to move in the daylight." Angeles National Forest was between Victorville and LA County, vast areas of probably now dead trees. It'd be plenty of cover for them to move through. It was going to be one long march, he thought. "Lead the way," Cameron told Weaver. "Head west." She stared back at Cameron, unaccustomed to being given orders, but she saw she was the only one who could. John was dependent on Cameron to guide him through the dark tunnel, as was Ellison on Savannah. She was the only one able to see who was unburdened, and also the most powerful of them. She'd be able to eliminate any threats in their path. She morphed into a silver sliver and disappeared down the tunnel out of sight. "Nice job getting rid of her," Savannah said to Cameron. "You shouldn't talk," she replied, her voice low. "There could be machines in the sewer. If there are, they'll hear us." They continued down the tunnel in silence, the only sounds being their breathing and their footsteps, both of which sounded far too loud to him. Cameron was right, he thought. If there were any machines down here, they'd be sure to find us. He just hoped the noise was louder in his head than it really was. Marching in pitch blackness with only 2 of the group able to see or realistically have a chance of defending themselves. Another fine day on Planet Connor. He felt Cameron's hand squeeze his for the barest fraction of a second, so quick and so faint that John wasn't sure if he hadn't just imagined it. But it reminded him of what he'd achieved already. He'd gone through hell, but now he had her back. The worst part was over as far as he could see, and it should be all downhill from now on. Considering that, he thought, maybe it wasn't so bad. Kyle limped down the stairs to the station platform, leaning on the rail a little, and clenched his jaw in pain every time he put weight down on his left foot. It wasn't as bad as it had been. At least he could walk around without crutches now. If they'd had a doctor among them, he doubtless would have told Kyle he was doing too much too soon, but he had no choice. He wasn't going to let himself be a burden or slow the others down. He'd pulled his own weight even with the injury, as would have been expected from anyone in the group. He was only walking or limping wounded. He could still help. Downstairs was a frenzy of activity. Everyone was busy on their own tasks, working to get them all ready to move. He saw Allison sat on the ground with almost their entire armory spread out around her, and boxes of ammunition, grenades, and improvised explosives were stacked out on display. Dozens of magazines had been placed into neat piles, and she was sorting through it all. As always, Cassie sat faithfully by her side. "Hey," he limped up to her. She flashed him a brief, but bright smile. Something he hadn't seen on her face in a long time. Reasons to smile came few and far between lately. The last time he remembered seeing Derek smile was when he'd gotten wasted on some of Manny's moonshine about a year ago. "How's the leg?" Allison asked as Kyle slowly sat down beside her. "Getting better," Kyle shrugged, or at least he hoped it was anyway. "What's up?" he asked. "You okay?" She'd seemed to have cheered up lately, since their talk in the tunnel, and they'd spent a lot of time together since then. "Yeah," she said as she went back to the ammunition in front of her. "Just counting up our ammo, splitting it up so everyone's got their fair share." "What's the score?" Kyle asked, looking at the weapons all around her. He counted only 3 plasma rifles, 2 shotguns, an AK-47, and the rest were M4s or M16s, 2 of which had M203s attached. "Not good," she replied, dismay visible on her face in the dim, flickering light of the fires they'd put around to illuminate the camp. "Down to maybe 50 shots each for the plasma rifles, 3 full magazines for the AK, and only 5 grenades for the 203s. They both shared a wary look between them. If they got caught in a firefight, they were royally screwed. "We should have moved out a year ago," Allison said sadly, thinking of all the others they could have saved and the better chance they'd have had back then. "You can't think like that," Kyle countered as he started loading 5.56mm rounds into magazines. They had plenty of 5.56 left, but it was like a bee's sting to the metal. It'd take a solid week of constant firing to even put a dent in a 888 with an M16. "A year ago, we wouldn't have got out of LA alive. Tomorrow's the best chance we're ever gonna get." Kyle had memorized Derek's plan, as had Mac, so that if anything happened, hopefully at least one of the 3 would be left and able to lead the group. They would head south through the tunnels until they reached the end of the line, as far south on the outskirts as they could get. If it was light out then, they'd wait until dark before climbing up to the surface at Long Beach, the end of the metro line, then hug the shoreline as much as they could as they headed south until they could cut east to the series of national parks and march through them until they crossed into Mexico. It would be a hellish journey and a long shot, but it was their best and only chance. Mac marched down onto the platform and stepped over to them with a large dead animal over his shoulder. He dropped it down onto the floor, and a large beast splayed out on its back, causing Cassie to jump backwards in surprise. She edged forward and sniffed the animal curiously. "Wild boar," Mac grinned at them. Both Kyle and Allison couldn't help but lick their lips unconsciously. They normally ate rats, mice, the occasional dog that they managed to find. An actual pig was a feast. "Might as well eat a good meal before we head out," he said to the pair. None of them said it, but they all shared the same thought. They might never get the chance to eat well again. A similar thought crossed Allison's mind, and she waited until Mac picked the wolfhound back up and went on his way. She'd thought about it a few times since they'd spoken in the tunnel together, but now just decided to take it seriously. "I was thinking," she said, as Mac disappeared up the stairs with their evening meal. "Maybe after we eat tonight we could spend some time together." "Just the 2 of us." "You mean the 3 of us?" Kyle smiled in ignorance and patted Cassie's head. Allison never went anywhere without Cassie. "No," Allison shook her head and stared at Kyle intently like a hawk. "Just us. We might never get another chance." Realization sunk into Kyle's brain as he caught her meaning. He'd always seen her as a little sister, almost. Yeah, he'd had the odd thought about her, caught her undressed a few times and found it hard to look away, but he'd never even entertained the idea of doing anything with her. They'd been close friends since he could remember, and wouldn't have wanted anything to ruin that. And he'd been wary of getting that close to someone in case they got themselves killed the next day. She was right, though, he realized. They might never get another chance. "Yeah," Kyle nodded with a smile, sliding his hand over Allison's and squeezing gently. "I'd like that." Cassie snapped her head to the left, towards the left-hand side of the tunnel, and let out a low growl. Both Kyle and Allison looked at where Cassie was barking, and any thoughts of tonight were torn from their thoughts and replaced by a deep sense of dread and foreboding. "Someone's coming," Kyle said quietly. Cassie's growl erupted into a series of manic, vicious barks, spitting out flecks of saliva everywhere. "Stand to." Kyle shouted out to the others as he grabbed a plasma rifle from the row in front of her and Allison. She grabbed another one as Derek came and picked up the third, followed by Mac a second later, selecting the AK. One by one, the entire group picked up weapons and ammunition, arming themselves to take on whatever was coming. "What's going on?" Derek asked. "Cassie's gone nuts," he replied, earning a glare from Allison. She didn't like people insulting her best friend like that. "She's heard something," he corrected himself. Cassie chose that moment to bound from beside her mistress and leap off the platform down onto the track. She started running down the tunnel on the left before Allison intervened. "Cassie, stop." She shouted at the top of her voice, freezing the dog in mid-stride. Cassie looked back hesitantly, as if she were about to carry on regardless, but she held back as Allison ordered. They'd learnt one thing, though, where the threat was coming from. "Forget this," Derek said. He wasn't going to wait for the tin cans to hunt them down. "We're taking the fight to them. Mac, Allison, come on." Everyone else, grab whatever you can and get ready to move out. If you hear firing or we're not back in 5 minutes, leave and don't come back. Maybe some of them, at least, would make it. "I'm coming too." Kyle limped behind, holding his plasma rifle tight. He wasn't about to let Allison go anywhere where Metal was without him to watch her back. Not now. "Only if you can keep up," Derek replied. The four of them marched their way down the tunnel and away from the station platform. He couldn't believe their bad luck. Hours away from leaving this shithole city for good, and the machines just had to show up. He wondered if there was a god out there, what the hell he'd done to piss him off. The 3 humans and 2 cyborgs marched down the subway tunnel, weapons at the ready to counter any threat they came across. Weaver still took the lead, followed by John and Cameron, the latter now also armed with the RPG launcher, to then Ellison. Savannah brought up the rear, electing to keep as much space between herself and Weaver as possible. They'd been on their feet for days on end, only resting for short periods at a time, and John felt blisters starting to form under his feet from the friction of 4 days' constant travel. It had taken them a day and a half to navigate their way through the sewers beneath Victorville, all of it in pitch darkness, and being completely dependent on Cameron to guide him through the labyrinth. It had been a testament to her that he'd not tripped over once during the 40-hour hike in the tunnels, after which they'd emerged into the outskirts of the southwest side of the city. After becoming accustomed to the dark for so long, even the dim grayness that greeted them from above had been blinding, taking several minutes for the 3 humans in the group to adjust once more to daylight. John had them all moving both at night and in daylight through the Angeles National Forest, marching through miles upon miles of dead trees, bare of all their leaves, which had made the scene the eeriest place John had ever been, like something out of a cheesy horror movie. As soon as they'd reached the outskirts of LA County, they'd descended under the first sewer tunnel they'd found, having to move once more in the darkness until they crawled up through a shaft that had connected to the old metro system, closer to the surface and pocked with holes and vents that allowed air and some light inside. Now they marched down a seemingly endless Metrorail tunnel under East LA, only a few miles from downtown and their objective. Weaver knew exactly where she was going, having traveled the opposite way when she'd abandoned John to the humans underneath Sierra Corp. "Hey," Ellison panted. "Can we take a break?" "No," Weaver admonished. This was one of the things she didn't like about humans. They were weak. If a machine were running low on power or damaged, it would carry on until it achieved what it set out to do or it ceased to function. Even herself and Cameron, machines no longer bound by programming, would still carry on until the end. She knew a select few humans who would do the same. John, for one, plus various accounts she'd read of rather incredible humans who displayed endurance and determination far beyond normal levels, but they were the exception. "Yes," Savannah countered. John looked back at Ellison and saw him breathing heavily and sweat pouring down his face. The man was exhausted. He'd forgotten Ellison was almost 3 times his age. "We could all do with a break," John said. He sat down against the curved tunnel wall and saw a flash of irritation on Weaver's face as he did so, and as Savannah and Ellison sat down opposite. Cameron moved next to John but stayed upright on her feet, the HK-417 held in her hands. Savannah pulled out her canteen and took a swig of water before handing it to Ellison. "Finish it off," she said to him. There was only a few mouthfuls left in there anyway, and he needed it more than her. They'd already exhausted their food and most of their water now. John took out his own bottle and drained the last of it down his neck, following their example. "Once we get there, how long before you can get the TDE up and running?" John asked Weaver. Weaver didn't turn to look at him, but instead watched through the tunnel, keeping watch the opposite end from Cameron. "A few hours," she replied simply. Her words were simple, but she knew that restoring the time displacement equipment would not. She had no doubt of her ability to complete it, barring any unforeseen circumstance, but it would take time. A dog barked in the distance, and all 5 of them shot their heads towards the source. Somewhere down the end of the tunnel Cameron was facing. The noise was faint, distant, but getting louder, which all of them knew could only mean one thing. John snapped up to his feet and picked up his rifle. Savannah followed an instant later, as did Ellison, scrambling to his feet very quickly despite his age and fatigue, impressing John with his speed. John crouched down on one knee close to the wall and shouldered his rifle, and Cameron did the same, staying just ahead of him so she could block any shots aimed at him. Ellison lay prone on the ground and set up his machine gun, and Savannah took the opposite tunnel to John. Weaver stood in the center of the tunnel and made no move at all, remaining statuesque. "Fire when they appear," she told them. "Keep them distracted and I'll eliminate them. We're not killing anyone until we know what we're dealing with," John shot back at her. It could be just some innocent tunnel rats going about their business, and just happened to have the bad luck of having a dog with them that caught a whiff of either Cameron or Weaver. "Got that, Weaver?" John asked. She gave no reply, and he shared a look with Cameron. Her face was expressionless, but he could see in her eyes that she was thinking something similar to him. "John's in charge," she said bluntly to Weaver. "Not you. Without me, you won't get home," Weaver said. "Without John, we won't stop Skynet," Cameron countered. The machine resistance Weaver had conceived was gone. It had failed, John had succeeded. Everyone present was the beginning of his resistance. "No one fires unless they shoot first," John reiterated. The barking grew louder and louder, followed by shouting voices and boots hammering down on the concrete. It came closer and closer until he could just about make out silhouettes in the dim light ahead. 4, maybe 5 of them, Ellison said, squinting and straining to see. His eyes weren't what they used to be, just like the rest of me, he thought wistfully. "Is it metal?" Savannah asked as she flicked her rifle to automatic. Screw it, she thought. Either way, she was bringing out the big guns. She dropped the rifle and let it hang from the sling on her shoulder, and in the same motion brought up the M32. Metal or human, she'd feel better with the extra firepower. Cameron kept her rifle raised and remained poised to shield John from incoming fire. Her visual acuity was several times better than any human's, and she could not only see in the dark as well as if it were daylight, but she could also see further. When John, Ellison, and Savannah could just about make out shapes, she could see their features with absolute clarity. What she saw surprised her as she focused on 2 familiar faces and her mirror image. "It's Derek," she said to John. She hadn't expected to see them. She'd assumed they would have remained in the same tunnel, since she and John Henry had taken great care to ensure they weren't spotted by them. What the hell? John was incredulous. What were they doing here? They'd clearly survived the 888 attack, evidenced by Kyle and Allison's hunting him, and he'd figured they'd have moved on rather than risk staying in the same place. But what were the odds that they'd choose here? "Everyone, hold your fire," he repeated even more insistently. Weaver collapsed into a liquid pool on the floor that spread out wide and started to take on the exact color and texture of the ground and the track beneath them, blending in perfectly. "What are you doing?" John stared down at the ground. He had a feeling that Weaver wasn't going to listen, and this would end in people getting killed. Before long, 4 people came into view, and John saw that Cameron was right. He recognized the faces of Derek, Kyle, and Allison, plus a taller black guy he'd seen in their camp but hadn't gotten his name. All were armed, and he noticed his not-father limping on one foot as he approached. It didn't seem to slow him down much, though. John wondered if that was because of the firefight. He'd thought Kyle and Allison would have been killed by Cameron's airstrike. He felt the guilt over being responsible for their assumed deaths evaporating, but that didn't make this any better. Things could still get bloody for both sides. A large German shepherd bolted out in front of Derek and Co., snarling, snapping, and setting a beeline for Cameron as saliva flew from its mouth. Cameron raised her rifle and fired a shot over the dog's head. The booming report of the shot stopped the dog in its tracks and echoed out through the tunnel. "Hold it!" John shouted out to them when they were only 20 feet away. The dog retreated but still growled and glared at Cameron. "Connor?" Derek called back, recognizing his voice. Derek took a step forward and saw it indeed was him, though he'd changed a fair bit. He wasn't naked, for a start, and he wasn't the clean-shaven, spotless and manicured pretty boy who they'd found in the tunnels weeks ago. He held his plasma rifle tight and stared down the iron sights he'd attached some years ago at John, not that he could really miss at this distance. John stared straight back at Derek. Both their weapons were pointed at each other, as were all the others. Cameron was poised to trade fire with Allison. Ellison's machine gun was aimed at Kyle as he stared up the barrel of the younger man's plasma rifle, and Savannah held her M32 at Mac, though the blast from a single shot would be enough to take out all 4 targets at once, but probably not before they fired off a few shots of their own. They could probably win a firefight, just about, but he didn't fancy the chances of any of them walking away. "Mexican standoff," Derek commented gruffly. John nodded in agreement, probably the first thing they'd seen eye to eye on since he'd arrived in the future. "We've got the advantage," John gestured to the side at Cameron. "So let's talk." Allison glared at John with utter contempt, not even realizing she was also trembling slightly with fear. Cassie barked and snarled wildly, but remained at Allison's side, going crazy and just waiting for her order to attack. Saliva flew from her jaws as she stared at Cameron and anticipated tearing her apart. All the horrible things that had come to mind earlier now flashed in front of Allison, and she pointed the plasma rifle at John. It was only a moment later she realized that right next to him was her, staring with those wide, blank eyes and without any expression on her face whatsoever. Allison's trembling grew into full-blown shaking in fear and anger, both at John and the thing that looked like her. All she wanted to do was pull the trigger, so badly. "You're sick," she spat out at him and shifted her aim back to Cameron. Her fingers started to tense on the trigger. The ground behind Derek, Kyle and Allison rippled slightly and turned silver. It rose up into a gleaming chrome shape and started to take form into Weaver's new brunette facade. "I wouldn't pull that trigger if I were you," she said to Allison, still retaining her Scottish accent as the girl that looked like Cameron turned her head to look at the source of the voice behind her. Weaver grew another pair of arms out of her chest, and all 4 appendages morphed into chrome. Razor-sharp blades that tapered off to wicked-looking tips that grazed the back of all 4 fighters' necks, cutting finely through the upper layers of skin and just barely drawing slight trickles of blood from each of them. Derek, Kyle, Mac and Allison froze on the spot, not daring to move an inch and knowing the slightest move would get them either blown apart by John and his band of merry men/machines, or cut to ribbons by this thing behind them. Cassie turned round and let out a constant low growl at Weaver, baring her yellowed fangs at the Terminator, wanting desperately to rip her to shreds, but seemingly afraid to. "What the hell is that thing?" Kyle asked John, still holding his plasma rifle at Ellison, but more because he was afraid to make a move, even to lower the weapon. Was that thing some kind of machine? Was it Skynet's, Connors? It was. Alien was the only word he could conjure up to describe it, like it wasn't even from this world. "Mimetic polyalloy," John explained, remembering what the Uncle Bob T-800 had told him. He saw on their faces they had no idea what he just said, just like him at the time. "Liquid metal," he elaborated. "T-1000. 1001, Weaver corrected him. "What?" John asked, wondering what the hell the difference was. "Whatever." He turned his eyes back to Kyle. "She's the reason you're going to put your guns down," John said, "and we're gonna talk." "Talk?" Allison laughed bitterly. "What the hell is there to talk about?" Mac, for his part, calmly remained still and tried to work out what Connor's game was. He'd wondered what Connor was doing when he saw he'd only come with 3 others, but now he saw the kid had actually come in force. The old guy and the red-haired girl were clearly human, but Allison's Terminator twin was probably worth him. Allison, Derek, and Kyle all put together. And this other liquid chrome thing behind them, who knew? He'd never seen anything like it before. "We're not here for you," John answered. "You're no threat," Cameron added. Derek thought he detected a slight insulting hint in the tone of her voice, as if they weren't even worth the effort of taking out. "We're not putting our guns down," he replied. "Tell us what the hell you want first." Weaver scraped the fine razor edge of her blade arm across the back of his neck once again and dug the tip into his skin lightly, causing him to wince from the cold of it as well as the pain as it cut into him ever so slightly. "You have no choice," she told him coldly. "Put them down," Kyle said as he slowly pulled his rifle's strap off his shoulder. He held the rifle by the butt and under the barrel, careful to make no sudden moves, and bent his knees until he was low enough to place the weapon on the ground. Mac nodded his assent and followed suit. Derek watched his brother and Mac disarm themselves and realized the machine, if that's what the hell it even was right. Reluctantly, he put his rifle down on the ground in front of him. "Savannah," John nodded at her, and she dropped her own weapon and moved towards their opponents. She picked up Derek's plasma rifle and kicked the other one and Mac's AK away, sending them skittering along the floor and out and away so none of them could dive forward for one. Allison kept hold of her weapon and trained it on Cameron. His finger was tense on the trigger, just a hair's breadth from putting a plasma bolt through the cyborg's head. The only thing keeping her from doing it was the needle-sharp blade prickling against her skin. In a heartbeat, John turned his weapon on Cameron's human double, his finger already taking up first pressure on the trigger. "Don't do it," John warned her. "You'd kill me over that thing." Allison asked as she shook her head. "You won't kill me," Cameron told her. "Killing me is the same as killing yourself." "It's not the same," Allison seethed. She actually felt offended that this tin can thought they were the same person. "We're not the same." "You're right," Savannah shot out. "Cameron's not nuts for a start." Cameron realized Allison didn't understand her meaning. "If you shoot me, John and Savannah will shoot you. Killing me kills you. If she doesn't slice you up first." Ellison nodded at Weaver, still standing behind them, ready and willing to cut them all to pieces without second consideration. Allison blinked, surprised at the machine's understanding. "Listen to me," John spoke aloud to Derek, Kyle, Allison, and Mac. "Remember when I told you I was looking for my friend Cameron?" All four of them nodded, remembering the wild stories John had told them. John continued. "Well, he gestured at her with his left hand over the barrel of his rifle, "is Cameron. I've gone through hell to get her back, and if you shoot her now, I'll blow your head off and let Weaver that thing behind you cut the others to pieces." John stared her down with cold, hard eyes, and didn't betray a single ounce of emotion from his face. "She'll probably enjoy it too," Savannah added with venom in her voice. She knew John was bluffing. He probably would kill Allison if she shot Cameron, but he'd never tell Weaver to tear the others apart. Whether they could stop her doing it was something else entirely. Cameron remained still and kept her weapon aimed at Allison. "I'm aiming at your two front teeth," she told her human counterpart. "The bullet will shatter your teeth, penetrate through the back of your mouth, and destroy your brainstem. No impulses will travel between your brain and trigger finger. You won't be able to fire back." She had detailed files and had used the technique several times. It prevented even a twitch reflex that could cause the victim to pull the trigger. But killing Allison wasn't necessary. She didn't have to die. "Please," she asked her. Allison stared at the machine in shock. It had just asked her to put her gun down. The cold facts she'd stated chilled her to the core almost as much as its final word, please. Since when did a machine ever ask nicely or otherwise for anything? Still. It had a point, and she felt her two front teeth tingle at the thought of a bullet smashing through them and lodging itself in her brainstem. The machine knew its stuff. It would know the best way to kill, of course, and she could see that if she squeezed the trigger anymore, it would be her brain all over the floor before she could fire a shot, and her friends killed over a useless gesture. The thought of the thing behind her gutting Kyle and slicing him apart was enough to make up her mind. "Okay," she said quietly, exhaling slowly as she pointed the barrel at the ground and handed her rifle to Savannah, who took it from her and went over to stand beside Ellison. "Weaver," John spoke, hoping his voice sounded as commanding as he'd intended. Probably not, he thought. Weaver withdrew her blade appendages, and the two pairs merged into a single set of arms again as she returned to full human form. Derek breathed out a sigh of relief, as did all of them. He was surprised that John had kept his word. A large part of him had been convinced that they'd open fire on them the moment Allison lowered her plasma rifle. He turned to John, wanting some answers. "You said something about talking.